All right. So why don't I start? I'm going to close the door here. What I'd like to start with is just telling you, some of you know what precipitated this shiur. For those of you who were at a wedding last week in New York City, and we were, there was someone made a wedding. I'm going to not reveal the identity, not because it's a secret, but just because, I don't want to make anyone feel bad for any mistakes that might have been made inadvertently. There is a statement by Chazal, Leis ksuva de lo ramu b'hu tigra. There's no such thing as a ksuva that doesn't involve some level of strife or controversy or mistakes. Over the years, people have come to me and said, I think, I've been learning. I learned in yeshiva, and I've, been from a yid for many, many years. And my nephew wants me to be Masader Kiddushin for him. So can you just walk me through it? And I usually end up saying, no, I will not walk you through it, because there's a ton of stuff that can go wrong. And it's basically saying, my nephew wants to donate a kidney. Would you help me? I know you're a surgeon. Would you help walk me through it, and I'll harvest his kidney? No, I'm sorry. There probably is a way for you to watch a procedure and see how it's done, but there's so many things that could potentially go wrong. And unless you know what to look for, and unless you know what those issues are, it can get very complicated at times. And one of the areas of complication is the ksuva, because it is a legal document. And we know that Chazal say that you're not allowed to even be misyached. You're not even allowed to be in private with your own wife unless you write a ksuva. We'll look at that Gemara very briefly tonight. So you have to make sure that the ksuva is written properly. That's only one of the things that could potentially go wrong if you don't know exactly what you're doing. And then the question is, what are the methods of rectification if you find yourself at the last minute under the chuppah? And it's like I was telling someone at the chuppah, I said, the last word you want to hear a moil say at a bris is whoops, right? You don't want to hear that under a chuppah either, right? Because sometimes it's very difficult to make remedies, and sometimes the remedies themselves are easy, but people don't know how to remedy the situation. So we had a situation at this chuppah where they called up a very prestigious Rav from the other side, who was called up to read the ksuva. He starts reading the ksuva and realizes that there's a problem with the date. The Masader Kiddushin who had filled in the date had put in Shivim Va'arba for the year, 5774, instead of Shmonim Va'arba. By the way, that's a sign that you're getting old, when you start thinking in terms of 19 something, and it's really now 2024. So you're old when you still think in terms of 1900 something. But so this Masader Kiddushin is putting in Shivim Va'arba by accident. It's an innocent mistake. And the question now is, what are you supposed to do? So this Rav felt that, sorry, we can't go further with this wedding. We need to wait until we have a kosher ksuva, and we'll have to fix it, and we'll have to write a new ksuva. And the Masader Kiddushin felt, I guess, beholden to this older rabbi, and then therefore started to write a whole new ksuva. And I came just as a bystander. I wasn't really interested in getting involved. But when I noticed that it was taking a significant amount of time, and I recognize that there's an aspect of tircha d'tzibur and things like that, so I went up, because the Masader Kiddushin is a friend, and I leaned over his shoulder and I said, would it be okay if I helped you take care of it? We added something to the original ksuva, crossed out the wrong thing, filled it in correctly, and I'll show you what we did in just a moment. And in 5 minutes, we were able to go ahead with the chuppah. And I'll explain to you why that worked. So there are really two parts to what I wanted to discuss for tonight. The first part is when you find a mistake in the ksuva under the chuppah, so there are many considerations. Is there an obligation to write a new ksuva, or is there an opportunity granted to go ahead, read the ksuva with the mistakes, maybe perhaps reading over the mistakes and reading them ba'al peh as they should be read, and then fixing it later, or is it necessary to fix it right away? So for this, I'd like us to get started on our sheet for tonight. I'm just going to share it on the screen, which you don't have in front of you. So the first stop in our Gemara is source number 1, which is from Maseches Ksuvas itself. The Gemara is deliberating, is it permitted to consummate a marriage for the first time on Shabbos? And the Gemara has a number of deliberations as to whether that's permitted or not, based on creation of a chabura, making an injury in case the woman is a virgin, right? But if we can get past that, which the Gemara seems we can, the Gemara says, Rabbi Ami Shar Lemivol Batchila B'Shabbos. He permitted it. So therefore, let's say they would make the wedding Friday afternoon, which was actually at one time a big minhag in Europe, because people couldn't afford to make more than one fleishich meal other than Shabbos. And Amrule Rabbanan, so the Chachamim said to him, V'halo ksiva ksuvasa. But what if there's no ksuva? In other words, if you're even allowing them to get married on Friday night, how are you doing this if the ksuva is not written? So Amr Lahu atfasuha mitaltalin. So as Rashi explains, in lieu of a ksuva, you can give her chattel, you can give her property that is as a mashkon, that is collateral for the ksuva, and you'll write the shtar ksuva afterwards in covering the man's property. But in the meantime, give her items that are of value from the man's assets, and that will act in lieu of the ksuva as a temporary stopgap measure. But the Beis Yosef derives from here, as we'll see in the Shulchan Aruch, that under no circumstances is it permitted to consummate a marriage without there being a ksuva or a ksuva surrogate. And the Gemara in Bava Kama says that explicitly, quoting Rebbe Meir, even though it's a machlokus between Rebbe Meir and the Chachamim, we paskin like Rebbe Meir in this regard. The Amar Asr la'adam sheisha es ishto afilo sha'a echas below ksuva. You're not allowed to live with your wife even for a moment. And live is not a euphemism here. You can't even have yichud with her, even for a moment if she doesn't have a ksuva. V'taima mai, and what's the reason? The Gemara asks, Kidei shelo tehekala be'einav lahotzia, so that it shouldn't be a trifling matter, an easy thing to divorce her. For Chazal, the ksuva is not a biblical institution. It's a rabbinic institution. It was instituted by Chazal for a woman's protection because there was a recognition that until very recently in the history of mankind, women were at a financial, economic, societal disadvantage to men. Chazal recognized that. They didn't want to make it easy for a man to have his way with a woman and then just dispose of her. And therefore they said, whenever you marry a woman, a substantial portion of your estate is encumbered through a promissory note that you indebt yourself to a woman that upon termination of the marriage becomes payable. Okay? And similarly, if a person would not write a ksuva, then it would be easier for him to divorce her. And Chazal didn't want to make it so easy for a man to divorce his wife. We've talked about in the past, I think we had a few months ago, a Sugya Shiur on the whole inyan of ksuva de irkisa, a ksuva that gets lost or destroyed, what you're supposed to do. And if indeed you cannot find your ksuva, then you have to write a new one. I recently did this, believe it or not, for my in-laws. They made aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. And in the course of the move, my mother-in-law couldn't find her ksuva. So there I was. I I have the nusach on my computer, so I personalized it for them. And I emailed it to my father-in-law. He got 2 witnesses and he gave his wife another ksuva. But it's a totally different nusach, but it's something that you should know exists. Now, based on these 2 Gemaras, we have a psak in the Shulchan Aruch that asr lihityachedim hakala kodem sheyichtav la ksuva. You're not allowed to have yichud with the kala before giving her, writing for her, a legitimate ksuva. Now, based on the psak of the Mechaber alone, it would seem that if you have a pasal ksuva, right, which is what we had under the chuppah, the date, if the date or the names are incorrect, then there's no question that the ksuva is pasal. And so we're in trouble, right? That's what it would seem. But now take a look at the Ramah. V'yesh mikilin umatirin lihityached below ktuva uvilvad shelo yiv'ol. There are those who are lenient, says the Ramah, that it's permissible to have yichud with your wife if you don't have a ksuva. You just can't have a sexual intimacy with your wife. Now, comes along the Meforshim, we'll see the Chelkas Mechokek, who's one of the Nosei Kalim, one of the commentaries to Even HaEzer Shulchan Aruch, and he says, Echad min ha'ta'amim, that the reason why the Ramah is lenient and says yichud is okay as long as you don't consummate. He quotes the Ran, Shehilo tishmalo, mipnei shehiyo da'at shehikala be'enav lahotziyah. He says a bride will not allow herself to be deflowered, so to speak, if she knows that there's no ksuva. And so therefore, we're not worried that if they have yichud, the man will take advantage of her because she'll resist his advances. And that's the reason why yichud is okay. We're not worried they're going to consummate it. She's smart enough to know. And therefore, he says, Al kain tov lahodia lazeh im mityachedim below ksuva. And therefore, the Chalkas Mechokek says, therefore, you need to let the woman know. You should realize that without a ksuva, you have no financial recourse if I decide to divorce you. So we're not allowed to consummate the marriage yet. You should let her know, make sure that her rights are protected. So based on that, Rav Zinner in Nitei Gavriel brings from a number of Sfarim as follows. Source number 5. Im ira v'nimtza eza ta'us baksuva be'emtza kriyasa, you're mamish under the chuppah, and you find a fatal error in the text of the ksuva while you're reading it out loud in front of the ganza oilam. Yesh lahamshich b'kriyata, you should continue reading it. Umutarin hachasen v'kala lihityached achar hachuppah, and the chasen and kala can have yichud after the chuppah. Ubintayim yichtavu haketubah mechadash. And then after yichud or during yichud, the Mesader Kiddushin can write a new ksuva and remedy the situation. Now, and what is the basis? So in the footnote Gimel, he says, as he quotes from the Ramah, "Diyesh mekilin biyichud below ksuva, ubifrat b'makom hadechak," and that's certainly true. In a dire situation where everyone's sitting there in front at the chuppah, v'dorish zman mu'at ad sheyichtavu haketubah mechadash, and it takes a little bit of time until you can write a new ksuva. And then he writes, v'yesh litzarif lazeh divrei hagon tiferes Yankov, and the Sefer Tiferes Yaakov gives another reason for leniency in addition to the Ramah. I don't know why he can't just rely on the Ramah. That in itself is enough of a reason. But he says, shechidesh d'chol iser hayichud hu dafka la'achar yichud sha'az hi kfar ishto. Aval hayichud sha'achar ha'chuppah ha'oise ha'nisuin az murtu lihityached ima ayin sham. The only time that you can't be misyached with a woman, even if she's your wife, is after the initial yichud. But the initial yichud you can have with your wife because that's an integral component of the nisuin, and that doesn't even require a ksuv. But in any event, what you see from here is very clear, just from the Ramah alone, that it was not necessary to interrupt the entire chuppah, to keep people sitting there waiting, and to go ahead and write a whole new ksuva. Now, the truth is, I've made this mistake myself, so I don't really hold it against that senior rabbi, because I've also made that mistake. I had a situation a few years ago where I wasn't the Mesader Kiddushin, but I noticed that there was a fatal flaw in the Ketubah, and that we had to wait a few minutes until the Mesader Kiddushin was able to fill in another Ketubah and fixed it. But the bottom line is that really what was supposed to have been done is that the Rav who was reading the Ketubah should have just read it as Shmonim Va'arba. Fine, there's the Ketubah, and we would have been done 15 or 20 minutes earlier with the chuppah. Okay, and it was especially important because as one of the people making the simcha told me, that in certain package weddings in New York, they require you to finish by a certain time. So every extra minute that you're taking for the chuppah, it creates it takes away from the simcha of the reception afterwards. So it's not kedai, it's not right. Okay. Now, so that's the first part I wanted to present. That if you ever find yourself in a situation of being Mesader Kiddushin and there's a fatal flaw in the Ketubah, don't fret, continue onwards, don't interrupt the wedding. That's point number one. Yeah.
Normally, is it in the case that's been described, you said that the person who read the Ketubah was on a found a mistake. Who normally is responsible for checking the Ketubah to make sure that there's
Yeah, the Mesader Kiddushin is usually responsible. And it's always advisable for a Mesader Kiddushin to show the Ketubah to somebody else. And those people should look it over carefully. Usually it's not enough, and we spoke about this once a long time ago. Witnesses who sign the Ketubah usually are not reading the Ketubah to verify its correctness, because they rely on the Mesader Kiddushin. If you remember, that's one of the reasons why we said some poskim say that it's halachically required to read the Ketubah out loud at the chuppah, because since the Eidim don't know what they're signing on, it's you have to do a giloi milsa. You have to do something that publicizes the text of the Ketubah to strengthen the ignorance of the Eidim. Okay. So usually what a Mesader Kiddushin does is if there's another rabbi, he'll show it to the other rabbi and say, could you mind looking it over? And it's a good idea to do that.
Is it standard procedure always to have a spare Ketubah?
And you should always have a spare Ketubah. I always bring a spare Ketubah and a spare Tanoim to the wedding. You know, it's also a good point. Okay. Now, the second part of what we wanted to discuss is now that the whole wedding was interrupted, and I decided to offer my services to the Mesader Kiddushin and say, I have a quick fix for your Ketubah, and you don't have to worry about it. And so I offered him a very quick fix. And the quick fix is that now, how do you fix a Ketubah that has the wrong wording? Can you just cross out words? Well, if you had a contract that had words crossed out, do you think that would be upholdable in a court of law? Like, in other words, if they changed the amount from $100 and then you saw someone added a zero, like you would say, come on, this piece of paper is worthless because someone filled in and someone crossed out. You know, how can you do that? So it turns out that there's actually a way, and this is applicable to all legal documents in halacha, not just the Ketubah. Remember, a Ketubah is nothing more than a promissory note. It's no different from Ruvain going over to Shimon, borrowing money and saying, I owe you $100 for the $100 that you lent me, and it's payable in 30 days from now. That's what a Ketubah is. It's a man presenting a wife a promissory note saying, I owe you 200 zuz plus additional monies, payable upon my death or upon divorce, right? That's really all it is a Ketubah. It has additional obligations that are included, but in that sense, it's no different from any other shtar. So how do you fix a shtar that has a mistake in it? You have to rectify it in such a way that the witnesses verify that the fix was done, and they acknowledge that on such and such a line, there was something that was fixed. So this is how what I'm going to show you from the Rav Shulchan Aruch is how to do it. This is a condensed version of the Shulchan Aruch itself. And when we have a daily Choshen Mishpat Shiur every morning, we've already finished the Sefer, but we learned a Sefer called Imre Yaakov from Rav Stern. It was one of the Dayan for the Badatz in Yerushalayim. And he basically took the Rav Shulchan Aruch on Choshen Mishpat and wrote like a Mishnah Berurah Perush, and that's what we learned for about 3-4 years. So this is the last section of the Rav Shulchan Aruch on Choshen Mishpat, and he tells us how to fix any kind of promissory note. This has nothing to do with Hilchos Ksuva. This is Hilchos Shtaros, okay? He says, V'im yesh b'shtar mechakim o otiot tluyot, o tevot tluyot. If, let's say, the shtar has erasures, or there are letters that are above the line, or there are words that are above the line, like you squeeze in a word above the line, do a little caret, and you put in a word above the line. O sha'avar alein hakulmus, or words that are crossed out. Tzarich lekayaman. So what you have to do is you have to substantiate the changes in the text of the contract. That is to say, sheyichtov b'sof hashtar, that you have to write at the end of the shtar. In other words, you've written a whole beautiful promissory note with, let's say, 5 paragraphs. You go back to read it before the witnesses sign it, right? And you notice that in paragraph 2, there's a terrible mistake. You got the name wrong, or you got the amount wrong, or you got the date wrong, or whatever you got wrong. So you cross out, you write instead of writing, it was supposed to write shmonim, and you wrote shivim by accident. So you cross out the word shivim, you write above the line shmonim. So then what you have to do is that at the end, before the witnesses sign, you have to write sheyichtov b'sof hashtar, teva ploinis hi al hamechak, o teluya, o avar aleha hakulmus. You have to say that in the erased part of this contract, we put in another word as a substitute, or there is a word that is above the line on such and such a line, or we crossed out a certain word. So you just basically specify exactly what blemishes and corrections were made in the Ketubah. V'tzarech lekayman lifnei shita acharona, shaharei ein lameidim mishita acharona. And you have to do all of that before you get to the bottom line of the legal contract, because you can't learn anything from the bottom line. Now, this is because the bottom line is most subject to being doctored, because sometimes there's a little bit of space between the signature of the witnesses and the last line. So that's why we usually write Hakol Sharir V'Kayam as the last line. Everything is hereby legal and binding, okay? So that's what you usually put. And he says, Va'achshav b'makomot shenahagu lichtov b'sof kol hashtorot kulan b'hakol sharir v'kayam. He says, nowadays, at the end of every contract, we write those 3 words. Everything is correct and what's the binding, right? V'imlo katav kain hashtar pasul. And if you fail to write that, we invalidate the shtar. Why? Because we don't want, once you write Hakol Sharir V'Kayam, you can't write anything after that. So this is sort of like a mechanism to protect addenda to be written at the end of a shtar. Ve'ein ha'edim choisim imolav l'meidin mishita achrona mashakasav ba lifnei sharir v'kayam. So therefore, nowadays, you could write in the last line of the shtar pertinent information, as long as it appears before the words Hakol Sharir V'Kayam. Shaharei ein lachush klal shabal hashtar hosif shita zu berevach sheinuchu ha'edim lifnei chasimasam kedei rochav shita. Because once you have the words Hakol Sharir V'Kayam, you can't write anything after that, and therefore you can write any pertinent information in the bottom line. You don't have to worry that additional information is going to be added in the space between the last line of the text and the signature of the witnesses. She'ein kasuv sharir v'kayim lifnei shita zu. Lefichach mekayim hamechakim batzluyos b'shita achrona lifnei sharir v'kayam. And therefore, assuming that you haven't written those words yet in your contract, hakol sharir v'kayam, any kind of indications of corrections that were made in previous paragraphs have to be written in the shtar before those words, hakol sharir v'kayam. Avalo ka'otam shetoim lekayem achar sharir v'kayam. And don't make the mistake of writing the addenda to indicate where the crossouts and the erasures are after the words sharir v'kayam. V'im shachachu lekayim lifnei sharir v'kayam. Now, what do you do practically speaking if you already wrote hakol sharir v'kayam and then you show the contract to someone and he says, you got the date wrong. You got to cross it out and you got to fill in shmoinim instead of shivim. What do? How do you fix it? Yachtemu ha'edim techila, v'achar kach yakaimu, v'yachzeru, v'yachtemu achar hakiyum. So the solution is very straightforward and simple. You've got a full contract that says hakol sharir v'kayam on the bottom line of the contract. Have the witnesses sign it, and then below the signatures of the witnesses, do the kiyum, which is on line 4, there's a word crossed out, and we've placed in another word above the line. Then you write a second time, hakol sharir v'kayam, and then you have the witnesses sign a second time to that one sentence of what's called kiyum, of the establishment of the validity of the contract. And that's the easiest thing to do. It literally takes 5 minutes or less, right? So I see the ksuva, crossed out the word shivim, wrote the word shmonim above the line. It was the second line of the ksuva. After the witnesses, there was a little bit of space, and I simply wrote, Husam kav al milat shivim. Let's see what's going on over here. It says, I wrote, Husam kav al milat shivim b'shura shniya. Ulamayla min hashura nichtav milat shmonim hakol sharir v'kayam. And then I wrote ne'um, a space for the first witness with a little line, and then ne'um under that, another space for the second witness's signature. It's not like it's rocket science, but if you don't know what you're doing, right? In other words, it would be easy not to know what to do in that situation. So that's the remedy. That's the simple remedy. It's not something that is optimal to do, but certainly once the wedding's been held up and the person says you got to fix the ksuva, so we fix the ksuva. Now, there's only one controversy left. And that controversy that is left is that there is a shita that is brought in the Sefer Nachal Shiva from the Maharam Mintz. Now, the Sefer Nachal Shiva is a very important sefer that is studied by people who are rabbanim, who are out in the field, who do Seder Kiddushin. And because it's got the laws of shtaros in it for various different events, including the Ksuva de Irkasa. So much so, this sefer is so important that there's even a sefer called Kitzer Nachal Shiva, which is basically an abridged version, which basically dispenses with all the lumdus and just gets to the bottom line for the Masader Kiddushin who just needs to get the texts right. So in any event, the Sefer Nachal Shiva quotes the Maharim Mintz that the imta'a b'shem hachasan v'hakala, that if there's an error in the name of the bride or the groom, oshelo hizker shemosam b'shem hamedina, or if you don't mention their names correctly, or you don't mention where the wedding is taking place, pisula ve'ein tolin beinei chiti, then it's puzzle and you don't have the option of writing or filling it in afterwards between the lines to squeeze it in. Gam shem ha'ir ein kosven beinei chiti, you're not allowed to write the name of the city between the lines. And then he quotes the Maharam as saying, Dehecha deta'a hasoifer bizman hashana o bashavua o bachodesh o b'shem hachasan b'hakala, that even if you make a mistake on the date, whether it's the year or the week or the month or the name of the chasan and kala once again, o b'shemot ha'avot, or if they're their father's names, de'ein mol tikkun klal l'kayim osa b'sof rak lichtov ksuva acheres, then it's not going to work. You can't do the remedy of filling in and then doing a kiyum afterwards. Just you don't have that option. He doesn't say the reason why, but it's apparently it's a chumrah that is added in the situation for when you leave out the vital information that is the toref, so to speak, the vital information of the ksuva. However, that doesn't seem to be the prevailing minhag and doesn't seem to be the prevailing psak. And I therefore bring you from the Nitei Gavriel, once again, a different chapter from the Nitei Gavriel, which is chapter 29 in Hilchos Nisuin, volume 1, Ta'us biksuva, if there's a mistake in the ksuva. Here, he's not talking about where the person's reading the ksuva, just stam, before the wedding, you find out that there's a mistake in the ksuva. Im nimtzu tayuos o hashmatos biksuva, lechatchila yichtavu ksuva acheres. Lechatchila, you should write a whole new ksuva. Uvishas hadechak efshel letaken al yidei tikun besof ksuva. But in a dire situation where, let's say, you don't have another piece of paper, you can fix the ksuva by adding a line at the end, just as we explained from the Rav Shulchan Aruch. V'zosim nimtzei satos lifnei shekosvu tebos hakol sharir v'kayim sha'az yichtov sheyesh tos b'shur plonis v'chulei v'yasakeno. And then, this is assuming if it's before you wrote hakol sharir v'kayim, you just write an additional line that there's a fixture on such and such a line. And then you write hakol sharir v'kayim and the witness is signed. Now, im nimtza hatos achar shekosvu hakol sharir v'kayim, but if you only discover the error after it was written hakol sharir v'kayim, or like we have in our fill-in ksuvas, and the witnesses have already signed, yichtavu im hatikunim v'gam yichtavu od hapam v'hakol sharir v'kayim v'yachzru v'yachtemu pam shniya. Exactly what the Rav Shulchan Aruch had said in contract law. You just write the one line fix where the error was found, on what line it was, and the witnesses sign a second time.
You need to make sure you have the same agent.
You should have the same agent. Yes, right. You should have the same agent. Now, in Halacha Gimel, then he writes, "Kisheira tos bisman o bishmos hachasen bahakala o ba'avos ein moel hatikun sheyekaymo basof." So he brings the sheet of the Mara Mintz quoted by the Nachal Shiva, that if the mistake is made with the names of the chasen and kala or their father's names, or the date, then it doesn't help to do this kind of fix at the bottom of the ksuva. But then he writes, "V'yesh mekilin demahani kiyum lebasof." But there are those who are lenient and say that even if a mistake is made with the name or with the date, then you can do this fix at the very end. And he quotes various farm, the Yad Aharon, the Shevet Binyamin, and the argument being is that it's no different from any other shtar chov, any other promissory note. And in the Sefer Ksuva Kihulchasa, which is a relatively recent ksuva, by the way, it's something that I found on my Otzer Chachma software. It's a very well organized sefer that goes through a lot of these halachos properly. He comes to the final conclusion. In Halacha Vav, he writes, this is in chapter 12 of Ksuva Kihulchasa, Tsuras Hakiyum Hikidalahalan. He says the way that you fix a ksuva that's malformed or that there's a mistake, right? You write before the words hakol sharir v'kayam, b'siyam ksuva yichtavu ozu otevazu otevus elu heim al hamachak. So he goes through the same rigmarole as the Aruch HaShulchan and as the Nitei Gavriel. And then I won't read halacha zayin, I won't read halacha ches, but he says la'achar kiyam hamachika osafa kosum v'kol sharir v'kayam, and then you write hakol sharir v'kayam. And if you just discovered the error after you wrote hakol sharir v'kayam, you write the kiyum, then you write hakol sharir v'kayam, and that's how the witness is signed. And then in halacha tesvav he says, ein moel kiyum bishmoseim shalachasana hakala va'avosehem. He says this will only work if you didn't make a mistake with the names of the chasen and kala or their father's names. Bein le'inyan mechicha, bein legabe ksivasim, bein hashuros o mechutz lahen. Regardless of whether you erased the mistake or you write the real thing above the line or in the margins. He says, ach Yesh sovrim shegam bohem mo'ol kiyum. But there are those who are of the opinion that that does help. Ubevadai diyesh lahachmir lechatchila b'davar zeh ulahachlif et haktuva b'mitukenet. And certainly lechatchila, you should try to exchange the ksuva whenever feasible with a ksuva that doesn't have that mistake. But certainly in a situation like ours, you have every right to fix the ksuva. So that's what we did. We fixed the ksuva, and I told the Mesader Kiddushin, after the wedding is over and you have a little bit of time, write a new ksuva or just fill in a new ksuva for the chassan and kala, and that'll be the ksuva, and tear up this one. But in the meantime, you have a completely kosher ksuva. Yes. You can't sign a ksuva ahead of time.
No, so then if you rewrite the new one, you have to go back to the Adam again.
Yeah, you have to go back to the Adam. So do it that evening, sometime during the reception. Where the Adam is still there.
Haven't signed yet. You can make any corrections you need to make.
Even after the Adam have signed, you can make corrections, and you have the Adam, and then you write out Kol Shiur V'Kayim, and you have the Adam sign a second time.
But I see it's a bigger problem when people have pieces of artwork as their ksuba, because it's much harder to fix something like that.
It's not harder. It just removes some of the beauty of the artwork when you fill in a line at the bottom. But that's how you make it kosher.
Or you cross something out.
Or you cross something out and then you fill it in afterwards. That's, it's also the responsibility of the Mesader Kiddushin to go over with the calligrapher or the artist or the printer, whoever's doing the ksuva, and really read over a proof. That's why whenever a couple comes to me and they says they're using an artist, I say, I need to see a proof before it goes to print. Because I won't approve it unless I see a proof first and I have a chance to go over every single word. Yeah, Avi. Exactly. And that's actually one of my favorite companies to work with. I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of ksuvas with them. They've gotten better over the years, and they've got it down really to a science. What they have you do is you select the ksuva. I tell the couple, use Orthodox, Ashkenazi, Hebrew only Ketubah, Hebrew only. Yeah, and the reason why, by the way, the reason we don't like the Hebrew and English is because the English is not a translation of the Hebrew. It's not, because it's very unromantic when you translate the Aramaic into English. It's basically a promissory note. Like, oh, really? That's what you gave your bride under the ketubah? You didn't give her a poem? You just basically said what you owe her, how many pieces of silver you owe her. So because it's unromantic, so a lot of these companies will have an English text, which is completely dissimilar from the text of the ksuva, where it basically says, I promise that I will cherish you and that we will care for each other and that we will take care of each other until we are gray and old, and and it's very flowery and romantic, but it's got no semblance to the reality of what a ksuva is about. So that's why, even though arguably it doesn't invalidate the top part of the ksuva, because it's already, the English is under the chasima sa'idim, but it's deceptive, and that's why I don't like it. Blazer.
So in retrospect, this could have been, was there an objection to just letting it go? Because when you came by, you said you added the line.
Yeah.
It seemed like from what we learned tonight that in flight, it could have
been completely avoided.
Or was it like, I'm curious?
I think out of respect to the Rav who held up the whole wedding, like, I think it was important to find a way to have him save face, because he said, we can't go on with the wedding until we fix this. So I came up with a quick fix. We fixed it, and he was okay with it.
But you could have been stronger on the Rama.
But we should have been somech on the Rama had this person not raised an objection. But since it was very easily fixed and within less than 5 minutes, so that's what we did.
And the alternative, what he was looking for was to.
What really that the reader.
Redoing
Yeah.
You still need 2 signatures, right?
Right.
You added 1 line.
Added 1 line.
What was he gonna do?
He said you have to write a whole new ksuva. So the Masader Kiddushin was in the process of writing by hand a whole new ksuva because he didn't have a
There's no
spare.
filling in. I mean, there's a text there.
Writing a whole new ksuva from scratch with, he didn't have a fill-in.
Oh, they didn't have a.
He didn't have a
Yeah.
spare. They didn't sit
While
down.
after he had done half of it, I got up because I saw this was taking too long. And shortly after I got up, someone came from behind the curtain and said, I have a new fill-in, we can fill it in. So I said, no, that's going to take too long also. Let's just, I had already done, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah,
Isn't there a standard like RCA template, or like RCA Ketubah that you can?
sure, you can download it. It's easily downloadable. The Masader Kiddushin should have brought a spare with him. That was, look, I have a bunch in my office, in my desk. And whenever I'm Masader Kiddushin, I always bring spares, spare Tanoim and spare Ksuva. Yeah. Okay, so lesson learned. Now you know what to do when next time you're Masader Kiddushin. Yeah. Have a good evening, everybody.